This is the Multi-Faith Matters podcast. I'm your host, John Moorhead. Well, this is the podcast for Multi-Faith Matters. I am the host, John Moorhead, and I have a return guest today, Science.Chryssides. George, welcome back to the podcast.
Well, thanks. And thanks for allowing me, I think it's a third attempt now at having a conversation with you. So that should be good.
Yeah, let me just read a little bit of the bio. Folks can see this in the program notes of the podcast. George is Honorary Research Fellow at York St. John's University in the UK and was formerly head of religious studies at the University of Wolverhampton, also in the UK. And like George mentioned, this is his third visit back. Previously, we discussed his work on Jehovah's Witnesses. And we also discussed the last time he was here, he was co-editor of a wonderful book on contested concepts in the study of religion, which got a lot of interest from some of my academic colleagues. But today, we're going to discuss another book that he's a new book that he is co-editor with Dan Cohn-Sherbok, and it's titled The COVID Pandemic and the World Religions. And it's a fascinating book. I had the privilege of taking a look at it prior to publication, and the publisher was foolish enough to accept an endorsement blurb for me on the back. So it's all good stuff. So thanks for coming on and talking about this book. How did the idea for the book come about?
Yeah, well, I should say thanks for doing the endorsement of it, and hope you're pleased with the result.
Oh, yes.
The idea for the book, actually, it came from Dan rather than me.
Okay.
He felt that with the pandemic, there ought to be some kind of religious response, and Dan has got a lot of contacts with religious communities, so that was good. He managed to get, in fact, most of the people that contributed, Dan had commissioned. And I think I pulled my weight. I probably did a bit more on the editing. We felt that there had been very little serious reflection on the pandemic, mainly because it was new. It had only been on the go for about 18 months or 2 years. I can't remember exactly when we started, but the books that had come out when we had a look at what was already out there, they were mainly kind of devotional books, like prayers for the pandemic and things like that. And I mean, that's fine. We've no quarrel with that. It's important that people should respond in a religious way to events like that. But we also wanted some rather more serious reflection. So part of the brief that people were given was, it's not a devotional book that we're doing. It's not a how-to book. It's more a set of questions about the pandemic that we'd like contributors to address. So that was the thinking behind the book.
Now, of course, there have been pandemics throughout human history, and as long as human beings have been religious, they've been tapping into their religious traditions as an aid to grapple with these things. Did you have a sense when you were reading from contributors how the COVID response might have been similar or different historically?
Well, Christopher Lewis, that did the opening chapter, I think did an excellent job of kind of tracing the kind of history of pandemics and religious responses to them. I think the COVID one has been different in a number of ways. It's been absolutely worldwide, unlike pandemics like the Black Death, which were essentially European. Knowledge has moved on. I mean, in the past, pandemics have been attributed to bad air, or if you're wanting a religious explanation, it was thought that it was some kind of punishment from God, or there was some kind of human sin that was behind it, or that the gods for some reason were angry with humans. And there was a belief in some circles that it was magic that was the solution. We still get a bit of that, I think. We still get the very conservative religious view that either denies that there's a pandemic at all or thinks that it could be cured by prayer or by devotion. And actually, that is one group of people we decided not to include in the book. The people that simply said the solution is a religious one, that there's no cause for worry about the pandemic. Because I think I mentioned in my chapter people like Kenneth Copeland that said you can just blow the plague away. And he blew to his audience and said that's the Holy Spirit chasing all these demons out of here.
Didn't seem to work out.
Well, it didn't work out. It's interesting that the people that deny that there is kind of serious scientific work to be done on it. They seem to ignore the fact that actually the people that refused vaccination, including some pastors, actually died of the pandemic. So there's what we call cognitive dissonance in academic circles. There's a kind of mismatch between what they say will happen, namely, you'll be all right, God will protect you, Psalm 91 and all that. And then on the other hand, what is actually happening? I mean, God doesn't seem to protect people from the plague, or at least not everyone, and certainly not the people that don't go for a vaccine.
Yeah, well, who knows? You might be able to do a follow-up volume with the continuing debate now post-COVID about vaccinations and what worked and what didn't work, and all the finger pointing, how religions grapple with the post-COVID reflection might be an interesting kind of topic there, but who knows? What were the questions that you posed to contributors as you approached them and said, we'd like you to contribute to the volume? This is not a religious, you're not giving an apologetic from within your religious tradition as to why it's there or any of that or how to deal with it. What did you want them to address?
Well, we suggested 5 questions, and if I can do a share screen,
yes,
hopefully I can put them up here because it's probably more helpful if you can actually see them. Is that showing properly now?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so these 5 questions that we've got, it wasn't kind of tablets of stone. These were the sort of questions that we wanted people to address, not necessarily all 5, but whatever was most important to them. Dan was particularly keen on having some theology in it about how your faith explains events like that. But I think among them, the contributors addressed all 5 of these questions one way or another, not necessarily all in the one chapter, but the idea was that they might consider, why do events like that happen at all? Why does God allow it? How does it affect religious practices? Because religion is very much a social thing. So if governments are saying you mustn't socialize, you've got to isolate, how does that work? There's a lot of fear about touching things because the COVID virus could be on them. But particularly in my own tradition, which is Christianity, you're handling things like the bread and wine at the Eucharist, you're coming together, you're meeting. There's a lot of physical contact. How do you baptize people if you're not allowed to come into contact with them? How do you bury people? Because dead are not going to bury themselves. There are very practical problems. That's the Christian faith. I mean, obviously, there are counterparts in other religions. Like if you're a Hindu, you'll go to the temple and you'll touch the murtis, you'll bring prasad. That's again another possible risk of infection. So that kind of brought us on to question 3. What changes has it necessitated? So people had to kind of behave differently, either not perform their religious rites or else do them in a different way. And that raised the question of how much could be done in virtual reality. Again, that brings us on to question 4. What differences might we expect? Because a lot of us kind of went virtual or semi-virtual, and we've seen benefits of that. It's made a difference to it. And then finally, what have we learned from it? A kind of obvious wrap-up question to ask people. So that kind of briefly was the 5 things that we were after in the book. And as I say, some people went through the 5, some picked out 1 or 2, and among us all, we got a response to these 5 questions, I think.
What kinds of religious traditions are represented in the book?
Well, as I said, Dan has a lot of contacts with religious communities. We decided, obviously, to do what we sometimes call the famous 5 in the study of religion, namely Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, and Judaism. Now, I was particularly keen that we shouldn't talk about world religions, because you often get world religions equals the famous 5, plus maybe Sikhism. You get a kind of sacred 6 in some textbooks. And then some people would want to include the Baha'i. So what I wanted to do was to say, well, let's talk about the world's religions with an apostrophe S, not world religions, because that's a problematic term. Right. So we agreed on that. But also, interestingly, we didn't just want to privilege these 6 or 7 religions. Dan had contacts with people in the Jain community, the Zoroastrian community, and interestingly, native African traditions, which you don't hear a lot about. So that's a distinctive feature of the book. And then Dan wanted to add the Unitarians. And it was my idea to include Jehovah's Witnesses and Christian Scientists. As you said at the beginning, Jehovah's Witnesses are my particular line of interest. But numerically, there are about as many Jehovah's Witnesses as there are Jews, for instance. So why not include them? But also, I think the interesting thing about JWs and Christian Scientists is that both of them typically have got problems about conventional medical treatment. I mean, historically, Christian Scientists get the reputation for saying, well, it's all in the mind, focus on God, and that's the cure. So a number of Christian Scientists I've been in contact with were willing to write chapters. So we included them, and their task was to explain what the Christian Science position now is on things like vaccination and mind cure and the like. Jehovah's Witnesses, I think they still get the reputation for being anti-vaccination. That's not true. Actually, both JWs and Christian Scientists put on their website that we're not being prescriptive, but we would strongly recommend that you get vaccinated. There was a period in JW history where they were very suspicious of conventional medicine and questioned the theory that diseases were caused by germs. Round about, well, the end of the 1930s, that position changed, and they were much more amenable to scientific ideas and certainly to vaccination. So I thought it would be a good idea to let them speak to their own position on the pandemic. One thing that occurred to me about the Jehovah's Witnesses was that when you look at their past material about pandemics, there was an article that appeared in Awake magazine. In fact, it was the front cover that said, and that was back in 2012, it said the next pandemic when, and there was a picture of a ward with victims of Spanish flu. And interestingly, they never said when the pandemic occurred, we've told you so, see how good we are at prophecy. Because they get the reputation for being failed prophets, setting dates that don't materialize, and Well, that's another story. I think that's a bit unfair when people say that to them. But here was an opportunity for them to say, look, actually, we're successful prophets. But they never said that. And in fact, neither of the two contributors on the JW chapters made that point. So, they weren't anxious to make capital out of it. They simply defined what their own position was and how they had coped with the virus and what had happened and how things had changed.
Can you, just to give viewers and listeners an idea of what's in store, hopefully they'll pick up a copy of the book, because like I said at the beginning, I found it fascinating. Can you give a few examples of some of the responses from contributors, maybe something that stood out for you?
Yeah, I think the one chapter that stood out, I think it's the best chapter in the book. I mean, maybe it's invidious to make comparisons, but the chapter on Sikhism by Nikki Gunanda Singh. Now, that's exceptionally well written. She's an academic, and therefore her stuff is very respectable. But what she mentioned, and I hadn't known about it until I came across Nikki and her chapter, was that as some of us know, one of the key things about Sikhism is what they call sewa, service to the community. And they do that, among other things, through their langar, through their kitchen, where they distribute food to anyone that wants to come. I mean, anyone can go to the Sikh langar and get food. And of course, that was an issue in the pandemic. Can you continue to do that when there's a pandemic on and risk of infection? But one of the things that Nikki said was that not only did they have a langar that served food, a number of Gurdwaras had oxygen langars, because particularly in countries like India, because it's a respiratory illness, people were short of breath. People didn't just need food, they needed oxygen. And so a number of Gurdwaras actually had oxygen cylinders where people could come and they could get the oxygen that they needed. And I thought that was really interesting, not only because I hadn't known about it, but because it carries a kind of model with it, I think, that it's important to help people in the right way. That it's not enough just to kind of give money or to offer to go shopping for people. We all ought to be thinking, what do people really need? And I think Nikki brought that out very well in a very interesting way in that particular chapter.
Yeah, I think that is especially interesting because I think people in different religious traditions are used to responding to what we call natural disasters. All religious groups do that, but in terms of a pandemic, that was something that they hadn't seen, so they were responding in the moment to something unique. So I think that was an interesting kind of response that you point to there. In terms of production, I know the book came out this year, but books take a while to get done, from concept to writing to editing to publishing. When, in relation to the pandemic, were the authors writing these chapters and wrestling with the issues? Was it the tail end? Were we still in the pandemic, or how did that play out?
Well, I suppose we are still in the pandemic. There's still people catching COVID.
Right.
But yes, it was kind of when it was past its peak. I had a feeling you were going to ask me this, and I was trying to think about it, because people always ask things like, "How long does it take you to write a book?" And there's not always a clear answer to that. I think probably it was. Let me think. It was after I had finished the Jehovah's Witness book, so that would be 2021, probably towards the end. And I mean, people did write their chapters very fast because we were conscious that people would fairly soon have their interest tailing off on the topic. So it was when the pandemic was kind of on the wane, and then people did get to work fairly fast and produce the material.
As I always learn things when I am editing a book, not just about how to be a better editor and all this, but I always have some takeaways and insights. what kinds of general takeaways are there in terms of how human beings turn to their diverse religious traditions to respond to these kinds of challenges?
Well, I think the issue was how we could use virtual reality, because I mean that was the obvious thing to do, given that we're technologically more savvy than we were. As I said in the book, in my final chapter, when the pandemic started, we were in the middle of a Lent group in Lichfield Cathedral. It was supposed to last, it was either 5 or 6 weeks, a discussion group that met in the evening. And then we were told we weren't to meet anymore. These were the instructions that the Church of England had sent down. So I said to people, we could continue this group, if we all went on Zoom or on Skype. And everyone said, oh, we don't know how to do that. Well, of course, that's a big change now, because almost everyone knows how to use Zoom or Teams or Skype. That was the kind of solution. We didn't go down that road that particular Lent, but the following year, we were all able to do it, no problems. Now, going on virtual reality, of course, that raised other issues, like might there be benefits from it? Because it kind of seemed like a kind of poor relation. We can't meet in person, so let's meet on a TV screen. Well, actually, at Lichfield Cathedral now, it's common practice at every major service for cameras to be around the place and for people to view what's happening. And that's a particular benefit, obviously, to people that can't come because they're unwell or they're housebound. Or if you happen to be working at 10:30 on a Sunday morning, you can go back and see the service again. And I mean, sometimes if there are children screaming in the background and you miss parts of the sermon, you can go back yourself and hear what you've missed. And that's actually very useful. And there have been one or two people that said, well, actually, we prefer virtual reality and it's more convenient. Also, there was the question, how do you receive the sacrament if you can't be physically present? So one thing that happened was that people kind of looked into the past history of the Christian faith and discovered that in I think it was the 1559 Book of Common Prayer, that there was a provision for people that couldn't physically receive the sacrament. The priest could go to them, and then there was a kind of formula where the priest said, since you cannot now receive the sacrament physically, you may do so spiritually. So the practice of spiritual communion, that prayer is always recited now at a morning service for the benefit of those who are watching from home. So we've made a number of changes, probably for the better. Jehovah's Witnesses said, if you'll allow me to kind of continue just a bit. Yeah, Jehovah's Witnesses said, well, actually, in the past, we made provision for people that can't attend events like their annual memorial service. They could have a telephone link and they could listen in on their telephones. Now, that changed when they did the memorials online, because it wasn't enough just to do it by telephone. They actually had an adapted version that you could be present on screen. And people then who were housebound not only heard what was happening, but could see it as well. And they actually had an image of the bread and the wine that passed by your screen, so that you could actually receive the emblems, as they call them, in that sort of way. So I think there are a number of benefits that we've accrued through the pandemic. It's not all been bad.
And as I look at it, it seems to me that it of course, perhaps sped up some negative trends that were happening, such as in American Christianity with the decline in attendance for worship services. And the thought was folks would kind of come back afterwards, and that doesn't really seem to have happened. Did you have a feel from contributors how, if not attendance, and at least active participation in their traditions continue to be affected by post-COVID kinds of things?
Yeah, well, it raises the question of what is active participation, because I mean, virtual participation can be active,
right?
But I think the honest answer is we don't know. People will take stock of how many people switched on their computer screens. You can only measure computer screens. You can't measure how many people are actually watching the same screen.
Right.
So there are statistical problems about this. My own impression is that most people are back now. There are still one or two people that are wary about being in public places where there's close proximity to other people. But certainly in the circles I move in, I think maybe not exactly back to normal, but there's as much confidence as there was before the pandemic. We're also, I think, more conscious of hygienic precautions. You know, people come armed with their sanitizers, and there's still one or two people that wear masks when they come into church.
Yes, yeah, that's for sure. Is there anything else that you would like folks to take away from this great book?
Yeah, well, you said you were going to ask me about the takeaway. So I wrote the last chapter of the book, which was a kind of summing up. So I guess I'm the kind of takeaway delivery man, as it were. So yeah, one of the questions I addressed was, what have we learned from the pandemic? And I think one of the questions that interested me was, to what extent does one talk about a pandemic as being an act of God? I mean, we often use that expression, but in fact, as one of the Jain contributors pointed out, it wasn't an act of God or of the supernatural. Whatever way you look at the pandemic, it had a human cause. So, I mean, being a Jain, he was pointing out that it might have been meat eating that was the origin of the pandemic. Could have been poor hygienic conditions in the meat market at Wuhan. The other explanation, as we know, is that it wasn't that, it was carelessness in a laboratory. Because Wuhan is one place that has a laboratory that is investigating viruses, and it could easily have leaked out. But either way, it was humans that were responsible. And I think that raises the question of how much evil and suffering in the world is due to humanity, and how much is due to natural causes, or if you're a religious believer, divine causes. And I think we're beginning to see that the distinction between so-called acts of God and acts of humans is a very blurred one. Because as I pointed out, I mean, no sooner had people been allowed to travel abroad than people were rushing away to have foreign holidays in the sun, which I think was a really stupid thing for them to do. But obviously that's what they wanted. But I mean, not only is that running the risk of catching the virus, but it's not ecologically friendly. So, I mean, are we really learning the lesson that things like global warming are due to human causes because we're selfish and want to travel by air rather than just travel locally or do things online? I mean, to what extent are we really learning that humans cause an awful lot of suffering in the world? And if one thinks about the situation between Russia and Ukraine, for example, a lot of needless human suffering there, a lot of expenditure, as I point out, on armaments and the military. The question I raise is, supposing we were to say, well, we're not going to spend money on that. No one's going to spend money on that. We're going to put it into education, medical research, humanitarian efforts. Could we eliminate, well, we could certainly eliminate a lot of the evil in the world and suffering. Don't know whether we could remove it all. That would be an interesting question, but it would be worth giving it a try. And unfortunately, we don't seem to be prepared to do that. We're still traveling by air. We're still taking part in wars. To what extent are we learning? And I mean, that would be the message I would want to put across. That's something we ought to be learning from the COVID pandemic.
Well, there are a plethora of lessons, and it's just fascinating to read the contributors and look at. It's just a reminder of how we all see things so very differently, and how we tap into our religious traditions to view the world and respond to everything that happens around us, including things like the COVID pandemic. So it's a great book. George, thank you for coming back for a third time and sharing your expertise in your work.
Well, thanks very much for having me, John. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, and I hope the book will interest people.
Yes, folks can look in the program notes for not only a description and link to George and his academic work, but also the book title itself. You can click on that link and please pick up a copy. It's wonderful. George, I look forward to you coming back, hopefully on the next book or the next project.
Yeah, well, there is one book still to come out. It's a very short book. It's about field work on new religious movements.
Oh, very good. And when is that expected out?
It's by Cambridge University Press that's bringing it out. It's part of a series of very short books. It's only 30,000 words. This one's about, I don't know, it's 80 or 90,000. So the short books, and I hope it'll be of interest. It gives some account of things that happen in fieldwork, some of the issues it raises, and some of the issues that I've encountered in exploring new religious movements.
Well, it sounds fascinating. If I had the money, I'd buy a copy and make it available for all evangelical counter-cult apologists to perhaps give them a different perspective on new religious movements. But
there will be a short period where Cambridge University Press release it for free.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. So they tend to do that with every book in the series. So watch out for their notifications, and I'll certainly pass it your way when it's available.
Well, I appreciate that. That'd be wonderful. Again, thank you so much, and I look forward to keeping tabs on your work until our next conversation.
Well, thanks a lot, John, and hope we'll talk again.